Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cash Up, a weekly show where we converse with amazing folks in DFIR. And today's no exception. I'm really happy to be joined by Rob Duhart. Rob's a leader in the information security field who brings together incredible teams with a focus on building dynamic teams to create world-class information security programs. Rob started his InfoSec journey in DFIR, but progressed on to the CISO office. Rob currently is a member of the Federated Security Team at Google, founder and chief information security officer of DTLLC, a security assessment consultancy, an EC Council Global Advisory Board member, and a board member of the Cybersecurity Executive Education Advisory Board of Directors at Washington University. Prior to his roles there, Rob was director of Cyber Threat Operations Center and the director of Security Architecture and Applied Security at Cardinal Health. And prior to Cardinal, Rob worked for the Ford Motor Company, where he had numerous roles, including as the manager of offensive security, the manager of global data insight and analytics security, and Mobility, Diversity, and Inclusion Council chair. As I mentioned, Rob came from the DFIR space, as well as the government space, where he worked for the Department of Defense as the Deputy Branch Chief for Exploitation and Engineering, where I had the pleasure of working with Rob. In addition to the DoD, Rob spent time conducting analysis for both the Federal Bureau of Investigations and the U.S. Department of Energy. Rob has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Washington University, a Master of Science in Technology Management from George Mason University. Go Patriots! And the Chief Information Security Officer Executive Certificate from the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Rob is a certified ethical hacker and a certified information security manager. Rob's an advocate for both women and underrepresented minorities and does volunteer work with several organizations, including being a chapter founder of the International Consortium of Minority Cybersecurity Professionals, a volunteer for B-Sides Columbus, and involved with the Information Technology Senior Management Forum. He also shared his thoughts on both the wellness crisis in information security and imposter syndrome in articles he's written. I have the distinct pleasure to call Rob both a colleague and a friend. Having had Rob as my leader and mentor for years, after he left the government space, he moved into offensive security, where I encouraged my own husband to join Rob's team. That's how highly I think of Rob. Rob and I have had lots of fun adventures over the years. I really consider Rob and his family an extension of my own. We've traveled to meet each other for everything from basketball games to family events, and there's no better person to have in your corner, or to sit in a stairwell with to have hard conversations about personal growth. And with that, please meet Rob, one of my greatest mentors and friends. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for the kind words. It's almost overwhelming to be here with you again. I'm so grateful.
It's just such a pleasure to get to sit down and chat with you. And I hope people really understand just how much of a guide you've been to me in my journey. And I think your journey is so interesting. And what I'm really excited about in this conversation with a mostly digital forensics incident response audience is the fact that you did work in digital forensics incident response and then grew into the CISO office. And I think that's a really different perspective than we've ever had on this show, where that a lot of us get the opportunity to talk to someone who grew out from DFIR. So to start, would you mind sharing a bit of your journey?
Yes, I'd love to. And I'm actually going to go into a little bit more detail than I don't think I've ever gone into this detail much. I got into DFIR out of necessity. I was a young Black man, but a young man in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that had been trained by the FBI to go support cyber investigations and was assigned to the Milwaukee Cybercrimes Task Force. Those in the business that have done crimes against children work, innocent images is what we called it, will know the Milwaukee Cybercrimes Task Force. They're quite prolific, A, because of the AOR, but B, because of the great work they did. Two agents who I'm going to name by name because I don't often talk about them. One is Special Agent Brett Banner. I used to call him Papa Banner. He would invite me to his house and I'd spend time with his family. I mean, he was like an older brother to me almost. And then Special Agent Chris Saviano really challenged me to understand and learn not only digital forensics. So I spent thousands of hours, I think it was NCASE 3 or 5 or years ago, FTK3, something like that, right? UFED hadn't even come out, right? There weren't,
Oh, yeah.
mobile device capabilities at the time, but they challenged me to not only spend thousands of hours understanding digital forensics, but to get involved in investigations, whether it be interviewing, whether it be understanding, cart response, understanding the whole soup to nuts journey of forensics at the Bureau at the time. And I'm just forever grateful. It was a tremendous experience working with them, the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Department, the Waukesha Sheriff's Department. Learned so much from all of these amazing DFIR professionals. And that was how I got my start. I was hooked from then.
It's really interesting that you mentioned this. You might not know, but last week our guest was Ryan Benson, who's also at Google, but also started in the FBI. And the fact that both of you have had very different journeys, but have had that parallel where you did start at the Bureau in law enforcement, which is a very different aspect, and then grew into working for one of the largest tech companies in the world. That is a journey that maybe people don't always see when they think that when they start at the Bureau that they're going to be locked in. So that's kind of neat. Yeah, and so we've got two Googlers in a row.
I mean, and it's funny, Jessica, even from your and I's past experience, there's at least two other Googlers that we know that I meet with and spend time with on a weekly basis from
Oh,
our
that's
past
awesome.
experience together. It's
That's
it's
awesome.
amazing, actually.
So then coming out of the Bureau, do you want to share a little bit about what happened from there?
Absolutely. So as many know, the forensics field is so diverse, right? Whether it's hardware, mobile device, removable device forensics, whatever you have it. I moved from doing DFIR work operationally at the Bureau to doing more traditional analysis at the Department of Defense, a portion of the intelligence community, focused on leveraging those same techniques on non-traditional interfaces, right? So weapon systems, command and control interfaces. And believe it or not, right, the processes aren't that different. Yes, the platforms differ, but everything else is very similar.
Right. And I think people, and I've had a similar tangential thing where I did digital forensics on IEDs,
Yes.
and people sometimes forget that digital forensics on things in what today we call Internet of Things, or today we call SCADA systems, the techniques and methodologies that are used are the same, and they can be brought in. And the concept of going from doing child exploitation work in Milwaukee and those types of investigative skills and learning the whole soup to nut process, you can apply that even when you start doing bizarre hardware. And having worked in the same lab with you, literally bizarre hardware. If there was something that came in that had digital data, but nobody knew how to deal with that thing, that was the thing. Nobody in the world knew how to deal with that thing. Those are the things that your team dealt with. And that's such a awesome experience because you can't just look up a white paper or in a book or anything else how to do it. It's the methodology of how do you do things. That's so cool.
Jessica, you read my mind, right? We would write the book on how to do some of this work because the book didn't exist. And when I say we, I would say you, your staff, and we had awesome technical partners that helped us on the journey. And it was just
Absolutely.
applying the same technique that we used, leveraging tools that existed for other capabilities and saying, hey,
Mm.
could this work on this device?
So that's a really key thing. A lot of that was how do I take this thing that's meant for this and hack it to use it for another purpose? How can I gain some time advantage in building everything from scratch by using something that's not intended for this purpose, proving that I can do it forensically, and then applying it? And yeah.
And Jessica, that's the essence of offensive security, right?
Well, see,
And
I didn't even know that because I'm a forensicator, not a special guy.
and so we're going to talk about this more, I'm sure, but as we transition, as people want to expand their horizons and maybe leverage DFIR to grow in different directions, what you just described is an essence of that transition for me, which is that the skill set isn't that different. Maybe the application of it is, maybe the target is, and the mindset of it is, but outside of that, it's all very similar.
So I know we had these conversations when we worked in that same lab, and obviously we're alluding right now to the period where we worked in the same lab prior to me coming to Magnet and prior to you leaving government work. So when we both left government, um, what what brought you from going from that to moving to Ford and doing offensive security? Because that's such an interesting transition. And it's very possible we have folks here who go, I want to be red team, or I've always been interested in offensive security, but I landed in digital forensics. What was that process like for you, both technically and even mentally?
As usual, your questions are fantastic. There's so many layers to the answer. I would say when we were in the government, Jessica, right? Someone would bring us something. I'll
Mm-hmm.
say a target, and they'd say, "Hey, you're our last hope. We need you to do whatever you can do to acquire this information." And they would never really say, "Hey, here's your budget." They wouldn't show up and say, "Hey, Jessica, you
That
have
is
5 hours."
true. I will say the best thing I ever had in that lab was if I said that I needed an $80,000 tool to extract data from something, I got it. And I must say that that lab was incredible for that reason. It's because our mission was very critical. I want to be clear. It wasn't just because I worked for the government and the government's rich. This is the only specific place where this was the rule, and that's why I liked working in that lab. So,
Absolutely. From putting people on planes to take things places, right? I mean, if
yeah,
it's the
yeah.
only way, or driving it, right? Like,
Oh, I've done that, yeah. But we would do whatever it took to get the job done, and we were given the latitude to do whatever it took to get the job done as soon as possible. So, so how does that translate to offensive security?
here's what I'll tell you. So, in all of our friends that are listening that are doing DFIR or in the corporate world, they'll know that that isn't the world that we live in corporate.
No.
There's always a budget, there's always a limitation, there's always a time constraint, and the question is, do the best you can given what you have. And I realized pretty early in my grad school career that working in a place with an unlimited budget, given the mission, was a bit of a cheat code. I needed
It
to
was.
learn.
It was. It was. We
Yeah,
had
I
the
need to
AB up,
learn how
down,
to
up,
do
down.
this. Yeah, I need to learn how to do this someplace else, right? A place where there were constraints and where there were business objectives that were driving decision making. So, as strange as that sounds, I wanted to get out of government just to understand how everybody else lived.
I get
And
it.
and going to George Mason was a great way to open those doors, as you know Mason well yourself.
So for
And
those who
I
don't know, I'm a Mason alumni as well from their computer forensics program. That's where my master's is, and I still teach mobile device forensics at that university. I was schooling people on Android analysis last night, and Rob also went to George Mason, but he was looking at yours was a master's specifically in managing information security, which is incredible. For anybody in the DC metro area, the opportunities at Mason are great, not only because the topics are relevant, but the instructors tend to be experts in the field who actually do the work that they're teaching about. A lot of places you'll shun adjunct professors because they're less qualified, et cetera. But Mason's adjuncts, if you go to Mason for policy, you're going to have senators and judges teaching your courses. If you go to Mason for digital forensics, you're going to have digital forensicators teaching your courses.
You're going to have Jessica's teaching your courses.
But but this is exactly it. So it's a very great school for getting that grounding. So anyone in the DC metro area in the US, I highly advocate Mason, but I'll shut up on that.
And to bluff your answer, though, bottom line up front, right? Offensive security is applying the same techniques we applied to be able to extract data from all kinds of exotic hardware, just attempting to help organizations and companies take that same mindset and do it to their own capabilities,
Okay.
right? And so the mindset shift was minor. The target shift was major.
Right. So instead of exploiting a device to get data, I'm now exploiting a system to find vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
Now, for those who don't know, when Rob moved over to Ford and he was looking for a few good folks, as I mentioned, I encouraged my husband, who is a red teamer, to join his team. So it was kind of weird because then I went from working with Rob to about 2 months after we stopped working together, my husband being a remote employee from the house, having calls with Rob. And I'm like, hey, you took my boss. Your boss is now my old boss. It was very, very weird. But I will say another weird thing. So my husband is a red teamer, works in offensive security.
He's brilliant.
He's good at his job, and he does like hack the box challenges and all that stuff, right? OSCP, all that jazz. But he used to like really look down on what I do in digital forensics. And Matt, I love you. You're amazing. Until we were in Vegas and I was doing a DFIR CTF. And I was like, you think DFIR's bunk? Here, do this CTF. And I wound up placing third at that DEF CON CTF. And my husband got one question right, and he brute forced the answer. And that's it. He decided that DFIR is actually a really skilled profession. So.
And Hyde finally gets it. And here's another, collision of sorts. When Jessica and I worked together, I would just call her Hyde all the time, right? Because it's easy. It's military.
And I was in the Marine Corps. So I came from the Marine Corps there. So to me, Hyde was my name. It was comfortable.
And then Matt, when I worked with Matt, right, I would call him Hyde too. So at some point when we were all together, I'm calling people Hyde, but they're both Hyde, right? It was a fantastic collision of sorts.
That has happened because we've done things where our families have come together, and you have definitely called us both Hyde in the same room, and we didn't know who you were speaking to. So. But my husband and I also served in the Marine Corps in the same shop, and the same thing used to happen once we got married. He was a civilian, I was a Marine, and we all went by last names. So that's a common issue for Matt and I. But getting away from that, so you move into Ford. And you start doing this offensive stuff. So what's really neat about that is I feel like you were getting a much broader spectrum of InfoSec. A lot of people don't get to do both red team and blue team work. So from there, how did you take those skills and build it to getting into that information security management space?
Yeah, Jessica, you said it perfectly a few minutes ago about when someone would bring us a device, we would have to hack it and or figure out how we were going to get the information we needed to get. It was a mindset, right? It was, I've never done this before. This looks strange. Let me think laterally, is what we like to call it, to figure if there's anything else that I've ever done that could help us attack the target. In offensive security, it's very similar, right? There's rarely a book that can walk you through the steps towards taking over a domain controller, as an example, right? Hijacking a domain controller, or, popping a box using Cobalt Strike, getting shell in other ways. So you use the same mindset that we used in DFIR in our lab, but to move into leadership was more about working with brilliant people like you, Jessica, and like Matt. How do you help them and encourage them to unleash the work they did? Without getting into detail, Jessica, I remember, when we started working together, I had this vision, and the vision was Jessica doesn't need me, right? Jessica has everything she needs to execute the team, the skill set, the background, the panache, the communication skill, the executive presence. My job is just to almost be the Phil Jackson, the Yoda, the how do I position Jessica in a place to have maximum impact? She already has it. And that same mentality enabled the transition from being a practitioner to being a manager in the offensive security space. Because when you firmly believe the people you work with are brilliant, it's no longer about being the smartest person in the room and about pulling out that brilliance.
And I would say you did something really interesting, because we had a colleague who was an electrical engineer who we worked with in the lab doing digital forensics, extracting data from physical hardware, named Zach Albright. And you actually brought Zach Albright from doing that digital forensics work to doing offensive hacking on vehicle hardware at Ford. So you actually took his skill set, said, hey, is this an interesting way for you to grow? and brought him there to do that. And he's still there as well, working with Matt. And I think that that was really interesting because you saw how his skill set could be there, and you invited him to come join you and grow in that other way.
But that isn't that the essence, Jessica?
It's the
You're
essence.
correct.
It's exactly the goal.
Inviting people on the journey with you and then saying, hey, what can I do to supercharge your growth? Like, Zach, you worked on PCBs for, let's say, hypothetically, mobile devices. How does that compare to, right? I can say hypothetically, right? How does that compare to the PCB in a ECU, right? An electronic communications
electronic control unit,
ECU, a telematics control unit that sits inside a vehicle. When you open them, they're Tegras, they're NVIDIA Tegras. They all run, Linux, SE Linux. They're very similar, different purpose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, we can get into the fact that like BlackBerry was writing the software that these things are running on, and it was exactly the same as was on mobile systems, but we won't necessarily go into the fact that the file systems were the same and the operating systems were similar.
The acquisition methods are similar, right? I mean, just Burla, right? I mean, sorry to talk about, Burla, but just like there's all these capabilities that cross what we did.
Ben Lemire, okay, and so we should say this, Ben Lemire, for those of you who use Burla for vehicle acquisitions, Ben Lemire worked in the same lab as Rob Duhart and I. Yep. Heather Mahalik worked in the same lab as Rob Duhart and I. There's a lot of people who grew out of doing that work and are now doing things that you know about in the public sphere. So it's actually, talk about a launching pad lab.
Incredible. You can't make this.
So then how do you go from now management? How do you break that wall to get into the C-suite?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, that's probably one of the greatest challenges for a technology professional, as you know. Because when you're in the C-suite, right, you're speaking to non-technical people. And Jessica, this reminds me of all the conversations you and I used to have back with customers, we'd call it. It's not that different in the C-suite, right? They have a business objective. They have constraints and timing requirements they're trying to meet. And you have to understand their needs and their objectives and tie the work we do technically to the achievement of those objectives. So let's use Google as an example, right? Google is very comparable to the intelligence community in that at Google, there's 26 to 28 business units, all trying to function under one mission, right? All trying to function, right?
This is a familiar struggle.
Yeah. So imagine, and I'm going to name names and, shame on me if it's bad, but, DHS, FBI, and HSI walk into a room, right? They all are trying to conduct an investigation. They all have very different techniques, very different incentive structure, very different styles. They all want to do what's right for the American people, but they have very different perspectives. That's what you see when you walk into the C-suite.
But that's good. So it's the differing perspectives and so a lot of people get frustrated by that, but I will tell you, I used to get inspired by that because actually having the different perspectives on what is important and vital in a case drives a more robust investigation, a more thorough analysis. It forces you to look at things, especially we were in the position where, and I keep going back to that lab, which I know is weird, but we had many masters on the same data set. So we could be working a case and have 7 government agencies wanting to answer a different question from what the data was on the device. And it actually forces you to look at things more holistically and more deeply. So it forces you to be deep and wide, if that makes sense. And I think otherwise we're very narrow in our analysis.
And the C-suite is the same thing, right? You walk into the room, you have a CFO who's concerned about the financials of the company, right? And has a very keen eye on asking questions related to that. You walk in, there's the CHRO, right? The people officer. He or she is very focused on the people side of the business. Then you have the CEO, right, who has to have the 3 to 5 year view on where the company's going. And as a CISO or as a C-suite member, our job is to partner with each of them to work together to drive value for shareholders or users, right? And the difference is both vast, like you said, it's both broad and it's both deep.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So what do you do now?
Yeah, I love the question, and it's connected to what we're talking about. just like Jessica and I used to work at what I will call an interagency organization, I basically run the interagency organization for Google. So, think about Google, and these opinions are my own. They aren't the opinions of my employer. I want to be super clear about that. But think about what you experience from Google: Android, Chrome, search, Google Maps, maybe Waze.
Yeah.
Can you still see me, Jessica?
I can still see you. You're good.
Okay, good. I used the G word and my assistant popped up.
Oh.
You can't make this up. Assistant, right? All of these capabilities are basically business units. They're basically government agencies, if we're thinking about it from our
Okay.
old experience.
Yeah. It makes sense.
Is to bring them together and to say, hey, we all have the same mission. We all want to make our users safer. We want to provide an exceptional experience for our users and protect Googlers, right? We protect the data that we store from really sophisticated actors. How do we do it together? How do we reduce friction? How do we accelerate delivery? And how do we leverage the benefits that each of us have, right? Because the Android team knows Android better than anybody else does. The Chrome team knows Chrome better than anybody else does, but we only win when we work together.
Absolutely. I love
And
it. I love it.
Our
love
team
it.
is on creating frameworks to work together.
What a cool role you have there. I love it. I love it. So I'm going to ask you my favorite question, which is, can you share a story from the field, from your experience?
Goodness. Jessica, you remember this story as well as I do, if not maybe better. I don't know if my brain cells, I have baby brain or not, but
oh, and congratulations, Mazel Tov, on your little one.
Thank you. 2 months old and counting. I guess 3 months actually. Today actually is his 3-month anniversary. I guess we should call it. I remember, Jessica, you and I and Zach and a bunch of others working on an exemplar series of devices that there were only a few of them in the world, really, and we had to get some data from a challenging set of targets, and that was a 48-hour period. I don't think either of us will ever forget.
So I like this story because I know it's about an oops. So we received something, we didn't know what it was. I remember spending New Year's Day with Cesar Quezada, who some of you may know and had worked for Magnet for a bit. And he and I were researching, trying to figure out what this thing was. It was an unidentified device. And I remember, and we knew we were going to have to do something extensive to it, and there was no way we could test on the real piece of evidence. So we extensively researched, and I remember that eureka moment when I discovered what it was, found a matching board, and ordered 10 exemplars of this so we could practice, figure out a method to get data off. And we did, we had Zach, once we figured out what we were doing, Zach was our expert in pulling data off. It was double stacked chips, and we needed the middle chip. And we needed to not destroy the top chip because we still needed to communicate through it. It was a pain in the batuckus. And we had 10 exemplars, and it was like till 1 a.m. And we finally, the rule was he had to get 5 right in a row before he could touch the evidence. Yep. And he got the 5th one right. He pulled the chip off the evidence, and what happened?
We dropped it. And I don't know if it was, I think it was me. I think I dropped it. It was one morning. And you remember this, Jessica? We had this carpet that was supposed to be anti-static. It was, thankfully, but it was Berber, so it had this color that was like bluish, grayish, that just perfectly blended in with a chip. And so we're crawling on hands and knees,
trying not to break it, trying to find it. And this was on a mission critical case, the kind of case that you work 48 hours straight for and don't go home, and that you don't stop. And there we were at 2 a.m. The last thing we had to do was read the data before we'd start the analysis. But we finally were figured out what the device was, got the devices, practiced.
Because we're human.
Took the chip off the evidence and physically dropped it on the floor. And so there we are at 2 a.m. crawling around on our hands and knees. And we did find the chip, and we read it, and we saved the day. But yeah, it was that moment. Oh my gosh. And trying not to have panic, trying to have everybody just team together and go, we're going to get through it. But to be honest, it was because We did something we shouldn't have done. We shouldn't have worked 48 hours without rest. We should have hid it from our superiors that we were taking breaks and sent people for naps and rotated. And that was a lesson that we learned. And I will tell you that after that event, when I worked other things that were mission critical, I would have people take naps and breaks during the mission for the purpose of not having that kind of risk, because the time it cost us searching for that was actually critical, and we spent a lot of time doing it. So,
and it could have gone worse. Thankfully, it went well, but
you know what?
Yeah.
This ties to something you wrote, because this is all about the well-being of your people. And during Share the Mic in Cyber, you wrote a great article that is linked right now in the chat about well-being in information security. And I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit on that.
Absolutely, Jessica. So you and I have seen the good and the bad of our experience working together where we worked. And, it was not uncommon for our colleagues to be combat vets and to have experiences that were traumatic, even when they were serving, but even as they were civilians.
Can we get real? I'm just gonna share something.
Let's go.
So we had lots of different forensics principals. We had electrical engineers, we had mobile forensics examiners, we had tactical examiners, we also had video examiners. And the content in our lab was very hard. And I will let you know that Rob and I have been to funerals for suicides of people we worked with. And I know a lot of you who are listening to this work with noxious content.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of you work with stresses of the field, those of you who are in law enforcement, those of you who are in consultancy and dealing with companies even on their worst days, those of you who are in the military who listen to this. We are all here for each other. Please read Rob's well-being article. I don't ever want to go to another funeral because one of my people who I care about committed suicide because of the amount of noxious content that they were exposed to and how harmful it was. I'm sorry.
No, Jessica, you first off, you went through that experience. We went through that experience together. And that's one of the reasons I think we're all so close, because of these experiences. That is exactly why I am such an advocate for wellness in our community. There's such a crisis right now. In security, as a bad guy, when I do red team work or when I did government work, I only had to be right once. As a blue teamer, I have to be right all the time. And the one time I'm wrong could be a catastrophic event. That's a lot of pressure for a human being to carry.
I mean, I'm going to be honest. There were times where we were working cases and we were on time clocks of people being executed.
Yes.
Hostages being executed. And I know what it's like to find the evidence after someone lost their head. And that's a lot of stress on you. That's a lot. That could have I worked one more hour? Could have I found that 1 second sooner? Because there are real life consequences for a lot of us for the work we do. Victims and people who are currently in peril, and organizations that could lose their entire livelihood for the people they work for if they're not able to recover from an incident. And it's a lot of pressure. And so it's really important that we take care of each other. Yes. I encourage you to read the well-being article, particularly if you're a people leader.
Yes.
Because it's how we take care of those folks that we're with.
You have to give yourself grace, and you have to give grace to others. Because just like we dropped the chip, we're humans. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, your humanity is as important as your technical skill and as your ability to deliver, if not more.
And you can't deliver if you're not mentally well.
Yes.
And we have to recognize and be kind to each other. I came from a perspective, and you probably had the same perspective too, coming out of law enforcement. And I had this perspective coming out of the military, that I was so hard and tough that I didn't need mental health wellness, that would be a weakness, that, you don't want to expose weaknesses. And I can say that, and I'm going to be honest here, I felt that was even more critical as a woman. And I don't know if you felt that way as a person of color, that it was even more critical to not show that vulnerability in myself, right? We look for vulnerabilities in devices. So we think about the vulnerabilities we have of ourselves. But I think the answer to that is just like how we patch networks and how we patch devices and how we make sure that things are on their most recent update to protect against vulnerabilities. We have to do that with our mental wellness as well in this field. It's absolutely critical because of the hours, because of the drive, because of the missions, because of
Absolutely.
how passionate and deeply we care about what we do. If we don't take care of our mental health, we're not going to make it to the next thing and be able to do the next great thing and help the next person solve the
Just
next.
you made a point I'd love to accentuate just quickly.
Please, please.
Among the listeners today, I'm going to speak to you guys and gals. Those of you that are in law enforcement, when I was at the Bureau, we did something we call safeguarding. Jessica, have you heard of safeguarding before? And there were two ways of safeguarding, right? One was you walk into the conversation and you have your script, you speak to your script, you get released, and you go back to doing the job you love. The other is you tell the truth. And you talk about what you're feeling on the inside. You talk about what's happening to you, and they help you. Sometimes they pull you off of the work. I want to say to all the law enforcement people in the world who are safeguarding or going through similar experiences, please tell the truth. Please be honest, right? Your families matter more, your livelihood matters more, your wellness matters more. Then the mission will continue. You have colleagues that will continue the mission. Please don't deprioritize your own wellness and well-being.
I'm gonna share something about family that was the worst mistake I ever made in saying to my husband ever. I had a case. Sometimes things would come up and I'd have to leave in the middle of the night. And something came up and I had to leave. And I thought I was going for 3 days. Might wind up being several weeks. And I said to my husband, I said, I got to go, grab my go bag. And he was like, well, what about this thing with the family? And I said, sometimes there are things more important than family. There are never words in my life that I wish I could eat and take back more than saying that to my spouse. In that moment, 100%, I don't think I lied. I told the truth. The thing I was doing was more important than family. And that sounds horrible, but there were human lives, right? And so sometimes work can be more important than family. Please don't ever say that to your spouse. Please don't say that to people you love. It was the most hurtful thing. Like, I'm sharing things from my growth as I've grown, but it's just a good reminder too to take care of those you love. And sometimes we get so wound up in our missions that we forget how supportive our partners are and that there are things that we shouldn't say because they're hurtful.
Well, Jessica, once the mission's over, once the mission's gone, once I'm out of the community, all we have is our partner, right? Like, and our kids and our family, right? And they're still there. Um,
Absolutely.
and it's easy to be hypnotized by the importance of the work, whether
Absolutely.
commercial sector or the public sector.
And let's be honest, our organizations are good about making us realize the value and criticality of our work. I'm just saying, don't forget about the criticality of your family. It's part of that balance.
Of course, of
So I'm going to
course.
ask you a completely different question just so we can get a little less emotional here, which
Yeah.
is, what would be your go-to resource?
Yeah, wow. I tell people all the time, you remember we used to do our lab tours and we'd bring in important people and they'd ask the question, they'd say, why hardware? Right? Like, we're from fancy schmancy place X. We have software, right? Software is more important than hardware. What I tell people all the time is hardware doesn't lie. People lie, but their devices typically don't.
Data doesn't lie.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think hardware acquisition, right? Whether it be chip off, whether it be, through other means, other acquisition means, that has always been my go-to, because I think it gives you a view on a target or a car, for example, that you won't ever get from software. People defend software interfaces. They rarely defend hardware interfaces, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Whether you're chipping off, whether you're using another acquisition means, right? You're imitating the manufacturer, right? And you're
What?
um, hardware is not a defended today as much. You see it more with like the Titan chip and the A2 chip from Apple, but hardware tends to be much less defended.
So I'm going to be honest. Hardware may be defended on certain computers and modern mobile devices. It's not on the other things. It's not on IoT. It's not on all of the other things that are storing data and sensors that are in the world. So those are still very exploitable to get data for analysis. And I think that's really a valuable point that
Jessica,
those can be great resources.
do you remember, so stories, right? And I'm not going to go deep into this one because I'm pretty sure we can't go too deep on it. But I remember there was a bad situation in Tennessee, um,
Oh,
and and you know, I'm not going to go into the details, but when I was at Ford, right, this was a scenario that people thought of, which is if something bad happens and someone drives a Ford car to go do it, how do we help people, right? So how do we help the good guys understand what's happening? But then B, let's say, it's not a situation where there's a bad guy doing something bad. Let's say it's Bill Ford. I'm not going to quote Bill Ford, but let's say it's Rob Duhart driving a Ford car, and Rob is going to pick up his son from the hospital, and it's he doesn't need everybody to know that his son is at the hospital, right? How do we defend that too?
how do we
And
defend privacy while still for people, this privacy
exactly,
versus security is one of the most critical balances that's really interesting. As a digital forensics practitioner in the
yes,
broader infosec space, and as someone who got into the broader infosec space with a digital forensics background, there's this consistent balance where I spent years thinking I would never, ever, ever report a vulnerability because vulnerabilities were my access to get data
absolutely,
until I was working with Brian Moran, and now I've reported many, but I was working with Brian Moran on our research into the Alexa, and we found vulnerabilities that were harmful to regular average citizens that did not take high technical skills to exploit, didn't take a nation state actor to exploit it, and it was something that could affect your average person who maybe could potentially become a domestic violence victim or had a stalking incident,
yes,
etc.
yes, perfect
And we
example.
immediately reported it, and it was that opened my eyes in a lot of ways. And I've now spent a lot of my mindset looking at privacy and how it balances with digital forensics. And it is be answered. And I don't know if there's enough people who have enough knowledge about the things that need to be done that are working in policy positions towards that. Maybe that's an interesting area of growth where we're kind of today talking about for people who are moving beyond DFIR and opportunities.
Exactly.
This policy area might be an interesting area for people to play or consider because I don't know how you would get there, but it's really
Privacy too,
intriguing.
and building privacy in. So at Google, we spend a lot of time, and I'm not going to talk a lot about Google, but right, the same techniques that a Celebrite or any capability uses to extract data are also techniques that could be used maliciously. And so at Google, yeah,
Absolutely.
we have people that are thinking about, if I can acquire this image, forensically, what could someone do, maliciously as well, and building capabilities in. So privacy in depth, right? We talk defense in depth in the information security space, but privacy in depth
Privacy and
is
depth,
something
and
we're
how we
working with.
balance that, and how things that people are that we need to be able to do to save children. And so I
Yes.
think this is why it's important that digital forensics professionals are involved in privacy, because
Yes.
sometimes privacy advocates don't necessarily have the perspective of the fact that innocent people are saved on a daily basis by the work that's done by digital forensics practitioners, that corporations are spared from loss of all their data and from IP theft, et cetera, because of the work by digital forensics examiners. And I think that that needs to be enjoined in the conversations with privacy. I've had some interesting conversations with Matt Mitchell
Ah,
about
yes.
this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Matt Mitchell is one of my favorite people in the world, and I I have some interesting conversations with him about that intersection of privacy and security, where he's trying to help folks who are, dealing with providing privacy for folks so that they can communicate when they are in journalists, folks who are dissidents in foreign countries, etc. And he's helping these folks be able, from a human rights perspective. And I'm thinking about the other side that can also be used to protect, as somebody who's worked cases in that arena of the folks he's trying to protect, right? I mean, and so having that perspective is very different. And so then when we have conversations, it's not adversarial. It's about how do we join that together. And I think a lot of people think privacy and forensics have to be adversarial. Sometimes they look at things in different positions, but I think if the meaning is brought to it and the objectives, that proper decisions can be made. And it's fascinating.
And the incentives are aligned. Like but privacy advocates and security advocates and DFIR advocates, we all want the same thing, which is to protect people.
Protect people, yes.
And that's the straw, Jessica. That's how you transition from DFIR into anything else. As a CISO, and I'm not a CISO, but as a CISO, your job is to protect people. And that's no different than what I did in the beginning of my career in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for DFIR. We want to protect people. One of my heroes, and there's so many of these heroes. You're one of them, Jessica. Oh. There are heroes on the call that are listening to us talk right now.
Yeah, there are lots of heroes on this call.
Camille Stewart is one, at a colleague that I have today, who owns election security for Google Play. So today, of all days, this is go day for her.
For clarity, for those who are listening on the recording afterwards, this is November 3rd. It is the election day in the U.S. And Camille Stewart is an amazing individual who brings legal perspective as well as technical perspective to security at Google. She is the founder of one of the two founders of Share the Mic and Cyber, if you've seen that event, which was incredible. But what a brilliant voice. Yeah, today's go day for her, 1,000%.
Yeah. And you remember what it felt like when we were operational, right? Like,
I do.
Like when it's go day, right? So we have so many heroes across the nation right now that are fighting to protect the integrity of our election. And thank you. Hats off to those folks.
Hats off to all those folks, and hats off to all of our law enforcement folks who are standing by for whatever may come this week or over the next few weeks, and everything that has been happening. It's a very challenging time, and I just applaud all of you who are doing the hard work to keep people safe. And that's the thing. It's almost like if I cut you, you bleed, right? Oh, yes. We all have that in common. Yes. And we're all here to protect people, and we just need to find that common mission. I love it. And that also gives people exactly what they need if they choose to make that transition from digital forensics to broader InfoSec, to the C-suite, to offensive security. If that's your objective, it's that mindset that can help you. That's brilliant. And it's not.
It's all about the translation layer, right? All of us that.
Right? Go break out the OSI model. Go ahead.
If you know the stack, you know the model. It's how do you translate it, right? And we need more DFIR folks to be comfortable and to grow into security, whether it be offensive security or even CISO, like C-suite, CISO professionals, because you bring a perspective that is so critical and so unique.
Rob, so what makes you tick outside of InfoSec?
Well, I have a 2-month-old son. So that's definitely keeping me busy these days. We recently moved to California, so I'm enjoying the sunshine and getting to know the West Coast a little bit better. I love to read. I'm such a nerd.
What are you reading now?
So the book I have in front of me right now, I have two, and they're both apt. One is called Head in the Game, which is about the mental constitution of the world's greatest athletes and how they keep themselves sharp and healthy and well in the context of competing. And then the second is also an introspective book. It's called Managing Yourself from HBR, Harvard Business Review. And all about, to be a good leader, you have to be able to lead yourself.
So I will tell everyone that I used to work with Rob, and I will tell you two things about working with Rob, and he's probably going to kill me for the second one. So number one, I think he knows what it is. Number one is every day, and the reason I felt comfortable asking that question was every single day when he came in the lab, he had a different book with him that he would read on his commute, or if we had to take a train ride to another office or whatever, and he'd break out that book. He always had a hard book on him. We did work in a facility where we couldn't carry electronics, so having a hard book was necessary, especially if you wanted to read while you were sitting down and eating lunch. And Rob always had a new book with him. He's probably finishing a book every 3 days. The second thing about Rob is our name for Rob, our nickname was Shoeless Rob, because Rob does not wear shoes when he works. I can bet you, he's in his house right now, so a lot of us work in socks right now, but I will tell you in the forensic lab, we always knew what color his socks were, because he had nice socks. For the record, you have nice socks, but he would always work shoeless. And the silly thing is that Rob ran 2 labs on 2 different floors of our building, and he would ride the elevator between the 2 floors shoeless. So we used to call Rob Shoeless Rob.
So Jessica,
I hope you don't mind me sharing that. I loved it about you. You were always comfortable.
Googlers have never met me in person, right? Because
you've started work since the pandemic.
I transitioned virtually, but at Cardinal, they know me as the guy who takes his shoes off still. I still take my shoes off. In fact, if any Cardinal folks listen or hear this, when I interviewed people at Cardinal, I would regularly make it would be a journey of me taking my shoes off, Mr. Rogers style, to begin the interview.
Mr. Rogers puts on a different pair of shoes, just so you know.
So yeah, Jessica, and my record collection. So Jessica, my next lab that I'm sure Matt told you, when we were in Ford, when we built our lab there, I brought a record player to the lab, and we would play records in the lab. So records is another hobby.
I love it. I love it. And you obviously have your records behind you. Yes. And that's something that if you would have brought to our old lab, you would have never been able to take back out. So.
And it might have been worth it now that I think of it. Static media, right? Like records would probably have been the safest way to play music.
They would have figured some way to say that you were going to export data on it.
Oh, and to be honest, you given the skill set of you and the people in the room, we probably could have found a way. I'm sure.
That would have been good fun. I actually was commenting to somebody last night. I don't know if you saw, Raspberry Pi came out with a keyboard computer. Yes. And my first comment is, this is the Commodore 64. And then somebody posted a picture, because that's what it was. It was your computer and a keyboard, right? And then somebody posted a picture who had one, and they had the 5 1/4 floppy drive that you have on the side. And I said, do you remember the data set, the cassette player, your data on a tape, right? Yes. On an audio, well, they were data tapes. They were the same exact tapes. They were called data sets, which is stupid because a data set is something. So we just called them cassettes anyway, but
Well, and Jessica, just talking to you, I'm remembering things that I've kind of locked away in my brain for years. You remember when a previous leader asked us to assess whether or not noise canceling headphones stored data?
Oh my gosh. we had all of the basic security fights you could have in an organization, which was, can people actually use noise canceling headphones? And we had audio forensicators. Like we had a special team of audio analysts who came from like Hollywood doing like mixing and stuff and recording studios, and they would do audio analysis. And so they wanted noise canceling, very expensive headphones. And so the leadership was like, hey, you need to do an analysis on this particular model and ensure they can't hold data. It was really, really, really fascinating. We did that. And I remember the first time and that somebody wore a smartwatch in a lab. I remember trying to determine which Fitbits would be allowed as more technology came in and what could or couldn't be in the lab. And we have to do those assessments in addition to our actual mission work. That was kind of funny always.
I have to say this. There's 2 other things that, if I have time, I'll bring up. But one, I'm going to say, every time, Jessica, I'm at a store or I see the word Tizen, I think of you. I think of you. And the premise that, it's obviously, as an operating system, it's still propagating across Samsung devices. I still think of you. And we don't have to talk about why, but I think of you every single time.
And it's funny because when we did that Tizen work, it was beginning of Tizen being an operating system, and now it's prolific. I mean, I have Tizen operating system in my home because I have a Samsung TV that happens to run on Tizen. Yeah, Tizen's an interesting one. So much good time.
It was clairvoyant. You've always been a person who can see into the future a bit and look around the curve, we call it in the C-suite stuff. We say, hey, we know what's happening today. Can you tell me what's going to happen a week from now, right? And that's a great example, Jessica, of you doing that. And just an honor to be a part of the journey.
Good fun stuff. I still, one of the things I like about my role at Magnet is I still get to do a lot of research. Like, I am so happy that Jad and I did that Chromebook research prior to, which I know you're sitting here on a Chromebook right now, but prior to all of these schools going online. I am sure that SROs, and that there are going to be investigations now with the amount of Chromebooks that are now at home with at-home students and hybrid students right now in the K through 12 around the world, that these are going to have critical evidence on them, and doing that analysis of, is the data all in the cloud or is it on the device, and finding out there's unique sets of data in each, which that goes back to what you were saying. Don't discount the hardware for the cloud. Don't discount the hardware for what the software brings back. They have unique insights. There is data. There is never a complete data set on one or the other.
They work together. And it comes full circle, Jessica. We started this discussion talking about DFIR and innocent images, right? And here we are talking about Chromebooks in schools. And how are we protecting children? It's the same thing. If I'm talking to a DFIR person and you're looking to break out of DFIR and to go into another area of InfoSec, the premise is the same. The tools may be different. The thought processes may be slightly different. The language might be different. The premise is the same. Protecting people.
Rob, thank you so much. I think that's a perfect note for us to wrap up on, that the premise is the same across DFIR and InfoSec, that's protecting people. And I think those of you who have been wondering about what's next, that hopefully this inspired you to know that you have the skill set, you have the tools to use that translation layer and move across into other fields, either grow out into leadership or move into offensive security or security application security, et cetera, or policy. We talked about that, if those are the things you want to do. So thank you so much. Thank you for a slightly different episode where we're talking about how DFIR professionals can grow in different ways. And more importantly, thank you so much for continuing to be a mentor to me and continuing to be a friend. And I look forward to the day where I get to meet the little one in person and that we can all be together again.
Sooner rather than later. And thank you, Jessica, for Cash Up. Thank you for all that you do to advocate for our industry. You've been doing this for so long and you're so great at it. We appreciate you. And for the women and underrepresented minorities on the call, know that Jessica is an example of what you can be. And so am I, right? You can be better than us. You can go further than us. Don't ever think that we aren't here.
So the most important thing, the best feeling ever, is when your mentees surpass you. It has happened to me time and time again, and there is nothing more amazing than somebody who you met and you helped guide, and they just do incredible things. So please, if you're new in the field, or even if you're experienced in the field, you always need a mentor. Find mentors and find advocates. Advocates. Find your advocate. And then likewise, if you are in the field and you're seasoned, please send the elevator back down and help others up.
I tell this story often, Jessica, to people that I work with. I'm going to do it in 15 seconds. Jessica, you became a director before I did, right? And what I tell people all the time is the ultimate measure of a leader, in my opinion, is the ability to see folks that have worked with you surpass you and continue growing. And nothing makes us happier. Nothing should make us happier. And be patient. Your time is coming, right? If you do the right things for the right reasons, good things will happen to you.
Do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. So I've got to tell you, Rob worked with me in a lab, and that was probably the thing I said most in my lab. We had a team member who used to have a quote for everyone in the office on his keyboard on sticky notes, and mine was "Do the right thing because it's the right thing to do."
I spoke to that team member the other day, so offline we'll talk about that.
I'd love to.
Yeah.
I miss him. He's a great person. You know what? I'll say I won't say his name, but he was a comp sci guy. He was a developer on our team because we had developers and forensics examiners, and he was a developer who went the other way, and he's now in law enforcement. So your career can go many different ways. Again, thank you, Rob.
Thank you,
Let's wrap
Jessica.
up. Thank you, everyone, for
Thanks,
joining
everyone.
us this week. I hope you really enjoyed. Next week, our guest is Geraldine Blay. She is incredible. I can't wait to have that conversation. Um, been nominated for her examinations by the Secret Service. Incredible work she does. It's just going to be phenomenal. The full schedule for the rest of the year is up on our site, magnetforensics.com/cash-up. And that'll show you everything till the end of 2020. Plus, there's links there for the RSS feed and a playlist, see previous episodes. After we have Geraldine on, we have a great lineup. Everybody from Brian Moran, Lanita Hinch, Aaron Sparling, Catherine Headley, Richard Davis, Mary Ellen Kellen, and Kim Bradley. So we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.